Good evening. You're either watching or listening to Redwood Wonk. I'm with David Frank. My name is Eric Kirk. We are talking national political news of the day. There is so much to talk about. We had to narrow it down to three topics. It's just, that's just the way it works. But I think the biggest one politically, and it's one of our favorite things to discuss, is election results. A number of states had elections yesterday. Actually, California had some local elections as well, but nothing that involved me voting anyway. So, but there were huge decisions made by people across the country. I think the states will tend to focus on are Ohio, Virginia, and Kentucky. Maybe talk about Mississippi a little bit. Rhode Island had a little bit of a interesting result. They had a special election for Congress because there was a vacant seat for the House. No surprise that the Democrat won, but it is the first time an African American is representing Rhode Island in Congress. So that's an interesting development there. Rhode Island is actually a pretty white state. But I think what the biggest news, well, I'll just kind of summarize it real quickly. In Ohio, there was a referendum. They have ballot propositions like ours, not as many, and it's a bit of a different process, but they made a constitutional amendment that enshrines the right to choice with certain restrictions, but then there have always been restrictions. This coming on the heels of the Republicans trying to shut this down with a referendum in August. Didn't work out. It was this one passed by about the same margin. The other one failed. A side note, Ohio also legalized marijuana for recreational use. So this was an interesting result. A lot of complaining from Republicans on that, and we'll get to that. But the other big news was Bashir fended off a challenge from Trump-backed Daniel Cameron, who is currently AG and on his way out. But this is a Democrat who vetoed a trans rights bill, an anti-trans bill, and survived to tell about it. Actually defeated Cameron, and it wasn't all that close even. It was about 5 percentage points difference. I think most of the polls had him closer. This is considered an upset because in 2019, when he first was elected, it was considered an upset. And again, this is a moderate Democrat who is elected in a beet red state. So we'll have some comments about that. And then in Virginia, the Governor Youngkin, who had an upset win over McCauley over school issues and pertaining to Moms Against Liberty kind of stuff with regard to the curriculum and critical race theory and all that, didn't play out well for him this time around. Abortion was also an issue because he was planning to, if he could get both, the Republicans could take both branches of the legislature there, that is the state Senate and what they refer to as the House of Delegates. And not only did the Democrats hold on to the Senate, but they flipped the House of Delegates. So Youngkin is probably a lame duck president, probably not going to be running for president anytime soon. And he expressed today that he's disappointed in the voters for doing what they did, which isn't a good way to try to kick off anything outside that. So there are some other races. Republican held on to a strong challenge from Elvis Presley's cousin in Mississippi, but it was closer than it should have been. And there's some other results that we'll get around to when if we have the time. But I think I've named the most significant events. This was a great night for Democrats, universally stated. There really is no downside other than the anticipated loss in Mississippi. So, Dave, which one would you like to start with?
Well, I think Ohio is a good one to start with because we can introduce the overall big picture theme, which pervaded the evening and, to be honest, pervaded the entire year.
And while you're talking about it, maybe answer the question. Well, it's a no-brainer, but do you think Sherrod Brown would have loved to have the thing on the ballot next year instead of this year?
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, I think I don't want to spoiler alert here, but that was my immediate thought too. I'm going to talk about that at the end of the show, of course. But yeah, this got people out. I think there's a couple different facets of this which are really interesting. Firstly, like you said, they passed a constitutional. The voters passed a constitutional amendment to enshrine the right of abortion in their, in the state constitution. So that's a big deal, and it passed by 12 points too.
Mm-hmm.
So it was pretty significant. And as we've talked about before, this is consistent with what we've seen in other states, where when you kind of shake the tree a little bit, you find that there are Republicans and independents, not just Democrats, that show up when this is something that they can have an influence on, can affect, and because it affects them. Even people that are pro-life, many of them also agree with the idea that the state should have limited power. So there's a little bit of a liberty element to it. Yes. And so you can see that in the near parallel outcome of the cannabis legalization also was passed overwhelmingly. Yes. So these, again, it's sort of a liberty angle here, but also values. So traditional I say traditional, typically democratic values for women's right to choose, and also a people's right to choose about recreational drug use. One piece of information here that I thought was pretty interesting is that the exit polling there showed that Trump self-reported Biden voters outnumbered Trump voters by 2 points. So that's even in a state where Trump won by 8 points. Yes. So the motivation for people to actually go out and say their piece, in part, as you alluded to, because it's not a presidential election cycle year. Mr. Trump's not on the ballot, so it was motivating and it inspired other people. And one last thing I would say about this too is just like why I said it reflects an overarching theme across the country is because, as you know, for people maybe that don't remember, this is a trend. So in special elections and off-cycle elections, typically there's less voter turnout. So only the most motivated people tend to participate. I was reading through some of the analysis of the crosstabs, and they say, analysts say that typically voters with lower incomes and lower levels of educational attainment don't vote in special and off-year elections. And
which used to be the Democratic base, because for decades, off-year elections were really hard on Democrats, but it seems to be reversed lately with abortion on the table as an issue.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. And that's what I think is the rationale here, is that since the Supreme Court overturned Roe, there now the fight has devolved or evolved out to the states. And so people are actually, like I said, this is something they can contribute to, and think something that they can, actually say their piece. Yeah. So,
again, abortion is not going away as an issue. The Dobbs decision, I'm betting Republicans across the board are cursing the Supreme Court for having done that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually did hear some Republican strategists saying that it's good for the base when Dobbs came through, overturning Roe v. Wade. The base, many of the Republican base got what they wanted, but from the perspective of leadership, elected officials, strategists, party politics, it's like the dog that caught the car. You've been rallying your base and rallying your base and rallying your base, but now that you get what you want, you got something that's extremely unpopular, or at least sufficiently unpopular across the country to have a real impact on election outcomes.
And I just want to quickly, before we go on to something else, I think there are a number of factors in every election, but one of the really anecdotal stories that I think really angered many voters was when a child victim of rape had to leave the state in order to do it. Jim Jordan said that they were lying, that it was being made up. And then there were even talks about prosecuting the doctor, trying to, to extradite the doctor who did it or whatever. I think this angered a lot of people because Republicans are saying, oh, they're playing the Democrats are playing the fear card. Well, you played it yourself. This should not have happened. And anyway, we'll get back to it, but I'll let you continue.
Yeah. So again, I'm going to take the line here that as a reminder, Wisconsin Supreme Court flipped in this past year Democratic because this issue of the importance of this issue, and we saw something similar this year in Pennsylvania. So Pennsylvania, they had a Supreme Court race, and Democrat Dan McCaffrey won an open seat. So they have a 5-2 Democratic majority.
Which is pretty overwhelming.
Yeah, but he was actually out there saying that he represented the defense of abortion rights and other legal rights that Democrats fight for, and so it rallied the base around this theme. I don't know if you want to comment much more about Pennsylvania or the Philly mayor's race.
Philly mayor's race is interesting. We can talk about that in a minute, but yeah, but that Pennsylvania is purple leaning blue. I think at this point it is. The states kind of go through evolutions, but I think this is pretty much locking it up, and this may be a response to Trump. We'll talk about that in the long run, but that's a real good one. But we should probably make sure we have time. Oh, well, if you want to say something about the mayor's race, and then we should probably get to Virginia and Kentucky.
Yeah, I mean, basically, it was and I'm sorry, I'm not recalling her name, but a black woman. So she was the first black woman who's elected to be first woman to be elected mayor of Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, which is significant also. So I think that was worth mentioning.
Yeah, definitely. Why don't we go to Kentucky, because I think it's kind of simple and we could probably get it done, but it's fascinating. I mean, I've been reading the analysis of it, and Bashir won in a county that went 77% for Trump last time. Trump backed Cameron. Cameron is a really actually an intelligent, intriguing figure from Attorney General's office. I saw him speak. I was actually scared, and still scared at some point that he could actually be a very effective Republican leader. Scared from a Democrat's point of view. He was defeated. I think abortion was an issue on this, but I think also Bashir played it really careful. Tried to not emphasize the partisanship of it, and maybe there are a lot of voters out there, even in places like Kentucky, that yearn for somebody who actually wants to govern.
Yeah. So Sherelle Parker was the name of the history-making mayor elected in Philly. So apologies to her for blanking on her name. But yeah, you're talking about Kentucky. You're talking about Bashir. I think it's worth mentioning he has extremely popular and positive name recognition because his dad was a former governor. So he's got a brand in Kentucky, which is a really red state. But he's known as being moderate and pragmatic, and people can relate to him not just in the urban areas but also rural. He did really well in rural areas too. So when you look at that intensity of they color code the counties for a lot of these maps. And so you get to see the areas around the cities are like sort of a more bright blue or a light blue. And then
he did very well in Louisville and places like that.
Yeah. And to be honest, I'm not to go back too much, but like even like say in Pennsylvania, you see like the dark blue and the light blue around Philly and Pittsburgh, but not much else. The rest of the state is sort of pink. Same thing with Ohio. Around the cities, it's dark blue and light blue, and then the rest. So there's definitely a rural urban divide when it comes to the parties. And I wanted to mention that for Kentucky in particular, just because Governor Bashir is really a role model to a certain extent in how you can get traction and support even in rural areas.
And real quickly, maybe comment on the fact that the media was writing him off once when he vetoed the anti-trans bill, and then we need to cover Virginia in 2 minutes.
Yeah, I don't have too much more to say about that.
Mm.
I think it's one of those things where in a generally red state with that the culture war, it's like the tail that wags the dog. It really does seem to be decisive in many ways about how you can agitate and get the base out, but it just didn't seem to work in this case.
All right, I'm going to give you the last minute and a half here, or whatever we have, to talk about whether or not these results in Virginia, losing both branches of the legislature, means the end of Youngkin's young career.
Yeah, so he's going to get termed out as a governor, and the question is what's going to be next for him. And people were talking about him as potentially stepping up as a presidential candidate, but in fact, by losing the Senate and not taking the Senate as it was predicted to do so, and losing the House there, the Virginia House, that's a in a sense that's a landslide against him.
And abortion was an issue in this case too.
Yeah, that was my thought exactly. Especially that thing we've been talking about all along here, which is that it's really that abortion is the issue that is mobilizing the base. And when Republicans set it up as a culture war type situation, for example, like by Governor Youngkin saying that if he does get the House, does get the legislature, he's going to impose a 15-week ban. That's enough to mobilize base to get out. And I did see a financial breakdown too. Democrats really did a much better job fundraising across the board. All these states that we mentioned that had significant outcomes, Democrats, they are raising funds, and Republicans are not in these off-year cycles. Even though, say for example, in Virginia, this was really important to Governor Youngkin. So yeah, I think he came from the investment banking community, if I remember correctly. So he's going to land on his feet, whatever he does. But this just seems like a relative dead end for him in Virginia and nationally.
Segue, this was a good night for Democrats, but maybe not quite as good as a lot of Democrats might want to think, and we'll sort of get into that in the next section.
I don't think Joe Biden is mentally, physically capable of being the president of the United States. Hang on. I suspect if I took your phone and I took a look at it, I would bet on a daily basis that there are people urging you to run for president and primary him. Am I wrong in my assumption?
Well, my phone's been lighting up how well he did with the UK Prime Minister. My phone lit up and how he
That's a nice duck.
McCarthy on the debt ceiling.
Your phone light up?
My phone lights up with Republican friends saying, you know what? Despite all of the rhetoric, these bipartisan bills he keeps passing on infrastructure and the CHIPS and Science Act, the bipartisan work he did on gun legislation reform and around the debt ceiling, make me feel maybe he's done a little bit better job than some.
But that wasn't my question.
So the polls, despite these results, yesterday's election again was really good for Democrats. Good news for Democrats. Was it really good news for Biden? Well, at least Biden didn't sink any campaigns, but he didn't go out campaigning on the campaign trail for anyone either. His polling is really dismal. A lot of people say polling doesn't really count this early, and in a way it doesn't, because the polls are going to be completely different one way or another in another 5 months. But the fact of the matter is inflation is still high. It's still food and other items are still expensive, although price of gas is going down right now, but only so far. And other reasons, he is just not able to catch a break with regard to the polling. A lot to be said about that. Trump is ahead in several of the Midwest swing states. In a I think it was a Siena poll, and then behind, slightly behind in a lot of other polls. Now I think needs to be a caveat here, because the polls as they have Trump with 43% and Biden with 38%. Those kind of numbers. That means a lot of undecideds in there. And in 2020, there were a lot of undecideds early on, and they mostly broke for Biden against the chaos that Trump represented. So, but this is, but in the wake of this, dismal news, and maybe a lot of dissatisfaction over Biden, whether or not it's deserved, because personally I think he's handled the crises, the Ukraine and now the Middle East crises, as well as a president can do, but tightrope back. But people don't look at it that way necessarily, and so there's a lot of talks about whether or not Biden is going to step down at a certain point and allow other people to come in. And meanwhile, John Fetterman has basically accused Gavin Newsom of running a shadow campaign, running for that position before it's appropriate. He's going to be debating DeSantis later in the month, who was refusing to debate for a long time after Gavin Newsom challenged him. I think he realizes he got nothing to lose here. He's not even in second place in a lot of polls anymore. Nikki Haley's pulling ahead of him. His career is going down the tubes. The senators in his own state are endorsing other parties, or at least one of them, Scott is. So Gavin Newsom has been out attacking DeSantis, attacking Trump, attacking Texas. It does seem like he's running for president. Is he running for it in 2024 or 2028? Or both. Anyway, he hasn't responded to Fetterman. There are other people in line who might want to run too, but it looks like it seems, according to some pundits, that he's really positioning himself in case Biden does decide to step down. Dave?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting one, and this is what I think this is the topic that interested me the most, just because of all the hype that's been happening around these polling results. Typically, it's only people like you and me, and maybe one step removed from us in terms of political intensity, for folks that pay as close attention to this, as we do. But this New York Times Siena poll has been getting tons of press. Because in a climate where people are saying the majority of both parties, the majority certainly of Democrats, because we're talking about Biden here, the majority of Democrats are saying that they prefer another candidate. If you look at some of the polling results, the crosstabs, it shows like over 70% of the people think Biden is just too old to be president, compared to 39% for Trump, even though that they are similar in age. And also the mental sharpness, 62% are saying Biden doesn't have the mental sharpness to be president, compared to Trump's 44%. Only in temperament is it even close, where they're saying Trump does not have the temperament to be president, 55 to Biden, 51. So that's like putting your finger to the wind. What's the temperature in the room? Is that most people, or many people, just don't want either candidate. So we have on the periphery, we've got people like, for example, Dean Phillips. He's a Congress member from Minnesota. He's announced he's running, and he's running not because he wants to be president. He's running as a Democrat because he said somebody needs to step up because we need an alternative. And you've seen other people say something similar. So the question is your question was, is Governor Gavin Newsom, is he running to be president, or is he running because he thinks someone else should be president? And I think it's really, he would like to be president in 2028, but he wants to position himself now. If anything happens between now and 1 year from now, we're about a year out from the election. And it shows here, first of all, in like the betting circles, I just checked it out as recently as today. If you look at the top most likely person to be president, Trump wins that. And then Biden is a close second, but then third is Newsom.
Interesting.
Followed by Nikki Haley, Michelle Obama, Robert Kennedy Jr., and then Ron DeSantis, and then Kamala Harris. So when you talk where people are, and this is just betting markets, but the idea is that there's a lot of folks out there that are eyeing up Gavin as he could be the next president because of the temperature in the room. But not to keep filibustering here, but I'd like to talk about the poll real quick. The actual poll itself, the reason it's so important and so prominent, people are really talking about it, is because in 6 important battleground states, 5 out of 6 of those, Trump has a lead currently. Nevada plus 10 over Trump or over Biden. Georgia, Trump plus 6 over Biden. Arizona plus 5. Michigan plus 5. Pennsylvania plus 4. Only in Wisconsin does Biden have a slight lead. But here's the thing. Burying the lead here is I looked at the crosstabs of the actual survey. So all the breakouts of the ages and where they're from and what are the variations. And so when you look at the crosstabs, if it's the case that Robert Kennedy Jr. can get on the ballot and he's got plenty of billionaires behind him who could fund that, the current state of affairs is that Robert Kennedy Jr. Is a close third. Trump ahead 35 to Biden 33, with Robert Kennedy Jr. 24. So he's, within striking distance. If there's a 3% margin of error, you take Biden down to 30, Kennedy up to 27. That's a pretty close race that people aren't really talking about. He supposedly is taking more support away from Trump than Biden. But when you look at how this breaks out by age, Robert Kennedy Jr. has the higher number amongst 18 to 29. He beats them both. Amongst 30 to 44 years old, he beats them both. So we've got only people 45 to 64 and 65 and up that support Trump or Biden over Robert Kennedy Jr. To me, that says that there's a lot of discontent with the candidates as they currently sit.
Also people do, I think, and has tried to send messages in their polling responses, whether or not it actually has the impact that they want, whether or not it actually it reflects how they're actually going to vote in the long run. Saying you support Robert Kennedy when most people don't really know much about him, I think it's just like there's an alternative and people grabbing onto it. I think it's one poll, and I think there's a lot of panicking around it. Democrats always panic. That's just one of the things that they do. That's it's in their DNA to panic with even a single poll. I like I said, I actually think when you get to the core skeleton of it, that Biden is probably 5 points ahead at this point in terms of how people would actually vote right now, because I don't think most people besides Republicans are going to vote for Trump right now with it happening. Now, we'll see what happens after this latest. We're not talking about the trial this week. We'll talk about the fraud trial. But I should probably save it for a prediction. But I actually think Trump's going to lose that one. I think he and his attorneys know it. And we'll have to talk about that another time. But but the point is that a lot of this hasn't played into what the impacts would be with ongoing prosecutions of Trump. Hillary Clinton lost support overnight just because Comey suggested that there might be some legal issues, and they really don't want a president who's going to have a lot of legal issues. So far with Biden, they basically have Hunter Biden's laptop. It's actually not a laptop, I'm told, but a hard drive. But but that's it. There doesn't seem to be anything there, and so I like I said, but I think the bigger issue than his polling is, again, his age. And McConnell having his freeze up during a press conference, and Feinstein first showing dementia and then dying right in office, I think has a lot of people concerned. They're not, there's young and there's young. I mean, Bernie Sanders is older than Biden, but he's doing layups, practicing basketball. He's sharp when he goes on television and interviews people. He doesn't, so it's but with Biden, there does seem to be an impression that that he is losing touch. Whether or not that's true, it's just that's the impression he gives in his presentation. So I do think Gavin Newsom is prepping for just in case, but I really think he's running for 2028.
Yeah. You touched on a lot of different sort of criticisms or like alternative perspectives of the overall results of this most recent poll. Rightfully so. It's one poll. It's a snapshot in time. But a couple of things that I think are interesting. You did circle back around to the fact that their perception is that Biden might be too old. And like I said in the beginning, that's 7 out of 10 people in this survey. This is a big survey. This is nearly 4,000 people. And it's not by accident that they think that. It's not just that maybe he speaks slower than he did, he walks slower than he did. There's actually a full court press PR campaign in conservative media that is just hammering away about, just how unpalatable he is to continue in his current role. And then people take a pivot and they look at the vice president, and she's extremely unpopular. The two of them are just, their popularity is in the cellar. So it's not, there's like an adjacent fear, not just that he might be too old or he's a little step behind, but it's that the supporting cast around him is worse than him being in power himself.
Sure.
And that's like I said, this is conservative media, so not everybody's receptive to that. But young people are less and less paying attention to regular media sources and sort of going to independent media. And so that was one thing I wanted to mention. But also amongst independents, it's like 40% Robert Kennedy. And so he's got a relatively strong lead, as opposed to like 25% for Trump, 28% for Biden. Again, it's early, and that still leaves, somewhere short of 10% still undecided. These things are going to ebb and they're going to flow. Trump's got all sorts of things that could go wrong for him in terms of convictions. And in fact, there are other polling organizations that have said, well, what about if Trump gets indicted on any of these things? And there is nearly a 10-point swing once that happens. So if any of these court cases, in particular, probably the Georgia case, which is going to have the most impact because it's a RICO, it's a federal racketeering organized criminal enterprise finding that would come out of that case. But he still has his time to appeal. So it's not like he's going to be necessarily under home confinement or in jail if he is found guilty of racketeering. He may be running for office. We might find ourselves here in a year where he does have conviction on some of those counts, maybe not others. But they're under appeal, and so he's able to continue. Then the question is, well, how many of those 10% who said that they might go, instead of still continuing to support Trump, might go elsewhere? How many of that 10% are going to go? But I think more importantly, where are they going to go? If it's really the case that Biden is perceived as maybe too old and his vice president is seen as undesirable, which, I'm not projecting that, I'm sort of reporting it here, then maybe a third-party candidate like Robert Kennedy just might be, for some people, as long as he's on the ballot, a protest vote is not impossible here.
I think there's also there's something else we need to discuss while we have the 2 minutes of time. Is Haley is doing better against Biden than Trump. Haley is in some polls, she's as much as 7 points ahead. Now, granted, she has not really been vetted on the national stage yet. So this is, a young, really sharp, young compared to Biden woman who seems to know her stuff, seems to be really sharp and making an impression. She's probably going to have a hard time winning the nomination simply because of her Hindu background. That's the Christians are already attacking her for it, saying they don't believe that she's truly Christian and she shouldn't be bragging about her Hindu cultural, stuff. I mean, so she's got a problem there, a culture war problem. But the point is if they could nominate her, she would have a much better chance at beating Biden or anyone else. But it's one of those, they're kind of in a rock paper scissors formation there. I'm going to let you close out on that.
Yeah.
But, I mean, DeSantis is the only one losing to Biden in one of these polls, right, of the major characters. But I'll let you comment on the Republicans' situation.
Yeah, And I'm glad you mentioned Nikki Haley. You know, as we speak, we're missing the most recent debate, and to be fair, these debates have moved marginally. The support behind certain people, there's been some mistakes that people have made, but Nikki
she
Haley's
debates well.
Exactly. She's the one person that's really advanced herself into a solid position. And I want to reinforce that in this New York Times Siena poll. She handily beats Biden overall and across all the states. I'm skimming through it. Yeah, every one of these 6 states she wins pretty handily. So we really are looking at a real threat if she's able to replace Trump somehow as the Republican nominee.
Yeah, again, but she hasn't been on a national platform having to defend her position on abortion. And that's going to be real interesting. But we will be talking about this later. And next week, we might even be talking about this debate if it's not ancient history.
May it please the court. Guns and domestic abuse are a deadly combination. As this court has said, all too often, the only difference between a battered woman and a dead woman is the presence of a gun. Armed abusers also pose grave danger to police officers responding to domestic violence calls and to the public at large, as Zacky Rahimi's own conduct shows. To address that acute threat, Congress and 48 states and territories temporarily disarm individuals subject to domestic violence protective orders. Congress designed Section 922G8 to target the most dangerous domestic abusers. It applies only if, after notice in a hearing, a court makes an express finding that the person poses a credible threat to an intimate partner's physical safety or imposes a specific prohibition on the use of physical force. And the disarmament lasts only as long as the order remains in effect.
All right, our final topic goes back to the Supreme Court in session. They heard arguments about whether or not it is constitutional, a violation of the Second Amendment, for domestic violence abusers to own guns. I have dealt with this issue as an attorney extensively over the past 25 years. When you have a domestic violence restraining order against you, it's what's called the Kletz order, and it prevents certain things from happening. You're not allowed to enter a military base, for one thing, a number of other issues, but one of the things that you cannot do is own or possess a gun. If you get a restraining order against you, you are actually under automatic order to bring your guns to a licensed dealer, have them hold it in their vault until there is no longer an order. I've actually been on the side of this, liberal hippie attorney, helping people try to protecting their gun rights as a matter of principle, and I actually accomplished having negotiated with the other side when I was defending people who were accused of domestic violence, and a bunch of us attorneys would work out these deals, say, look, we won't oppose the order, we'll stay away from you, but let him at least hold his guns without weapons, that type of thing. The Attorney General back in 2001, I was in court when it happened in another case in Humboldt County, invalidated. He came and demanded as a real party in interest that the agreement that they had reached be invalidated, that if you have domestic violence, it doesn't matter if your victim doesn't care if you have guns. We care. And so it's pretty strict. And the restraining orders in California last 3 years, and you have to have some sort of reason to extend it beyond the 3 years. That's a lot of time people don't have their guns. Well, the case is in the Supreme Court right now that will determine whether or not this a blanket ban for a restraining order based on any kind of violence, actually, even if it's a bar fight, that be automatically mean that you lose your guns. They argued, the lawyers arguing for the Second Amendment position didn't fare very well. Ketanji Jackson actually said you're running away from your own argument at one point, because he was trying to argue history that really didn't make sense for the present. And what was interesting is the conservative justices weren't coming out in defense, which is a pretty good indication that this attempt is going to fail. But it's an interesting question. Should should a restraining order based upon violence automatically result in the loss of gun ownership? It's not a big deal to me, and not that I anticipate ever having the order against me, but I don't own guns. But it is a Second Amendment is in the Bill of Rights, and it is considered a major right, and you lose that even with a temporary before you've even had a chance to defend yourself. If there's a temporary restraining order that takes you into the hearing for the permanent or 3-year restraining order, anyway, then you cannot have guns. This is a big deal. Dave, what are your thoughts?
So I think we could do a whole show on this. I'll try to be as focused as I can. I really appreciate you flagged this issue for us to pay attention to. I did listen to the oral arguments from court, and I did honestly, I was surprised at kind of how I didn't know, I guess, this case is U.S. Rahimi. I didn't realize that what was happening in the federal courts around the country right now, because of the Bruen decision, the New York State Rifle Pistol Association v. Bruen, that as of that decision, Americans do have a right to carry firearms in public for self-defense, and that overturned a whole bunch of different restrictions on the difficulty that was put in place in many states for people to actually have a carrier's permit. But it's not just that carry permit that was affected by that decision. It's also the federal courts have been shooting down lots of laws. And anything that restricts your right to have a gun in your home is even more sacrosanct than your right to carry it around on your person. And the court, Justice Thomas wrote a decision, and in the Bruen decision that came before, and in there he wrote, nothing in the Second Amendment's text draws a home or public distinction with the respect to the right to keep and bear arms. And he also said, people shouldn't have to prove ahead of time that they are worthy to carry a gun. You have to make the case why they can't, basically. And then so that's what was at stake in this Rahimi case, is that what's the standard, right? So what is the standard for people no longer being able to hold their guns? And so in Justice Thomas's decision, he wrote, and the majority of the court, I think it was 6-3, signed on to a new test, air quotes new, the text, history, and tradition test that was laid out for gun rights cases. So these courts have been saying, hey, there was no mention of this in the 1700s and 1800s, therefore this law is unconstitutional. So they're striking down a whole bunch of stuff, and that now includes limiting domestic abusers' access. So in the oral arguments, there was a whole bunch of sort of back and forth with the Solicitor General the Attorney General. I think they just called her General, Solicitor General. There you go, Solicitor General Elizabeth Prelogar. And she basically says, look, I want people to know there is a profound misreading of this Bruen decision. And Justice Kagan, she even said, there seems to be a fair bit of division and a fair bit of confusion about what Bruen means and what it requires of the lower courts. The reason I went through all this is because I really do think that they are going to have to more broadly write this and kind of cover their tracks, kind of make up for the fact that what Thomas put in there, this constructionist, this originalist reading, is just not applicable in many ways. So they spent most of their time talking about what is the real test here? Did they used to take away guns for people who were dangerous? Right. And then so there's this standards, there's this language in federal court about responsible ownership. And so they kept pushing back, like, well, is there two standards? How do we balance the standards? And she said, no, you guys said we can't do the balance. Justice Thomas wrote, no more balancing of standards. We just need one standard. And then they said, well, you said responsible and you said dangerous. Which one is it here? In effect, and to put words in their mouth. But she said, well, you have to understand that, responsibility is a little bit broader. Dangerous is a little bit more focused. So we are using dangerous, but in fact, the traditional historic law used to say, well, you couldn't have a gun if you were a slave. You couldn't have a gun if you were a
That's
Native
right.
American.
Yeah, and that's what, and they're citing all of this.
Yeah, I'll let you go. Sorry.
Yeah, while it's going, I want to correct myself though. Apologize. It was not Jackson who said that the attorney was running from his argument. It was Justice Elena Kagan who said, "I feel like you're running away from your argument, because the implications of your argument are just so untenable." And no conservative justice came to the attorney. His name is Matthew Wright. Defense on that. That's a pretty good sign that the ban for domestic violence orders is going to be upheld. This is there's also Zaki. One of the cases is Zaki Rahimi, a Texas man whose partner obtained a restraining order against him in February 2020, argues that he cannot be prosecuted. He continued to own guns, and he was actually criminally prosecuted. He's basically trying to argue that prosecution cannot take place because it's unconstitutional, and it really just does not look like it's going to fly. He's going to be facing prosecution, very likely. But it is interesting that they don't want this, and this would really look bad, because here we have people, they always say, well, we need to only keep guns away from the bad people, right? Well, what's worse than a domestic abuser? I think even Republicans don't want a lot of them don't want to be tagged with defending domestic abuse. We have a lot more awareness of it now as a society, when it used to be pretty much hidden away. Still a lot of problems with fleshing it out, but it used to, the times that they're talking about, it wasn't even illegal for a man to strike his wife in a lot of cases. So it just was we're talking about a situation where these conservative attorneys just aren't quite used to having to deal with this, because it just wasn't something that came up in law before. I think they went in with a bad strategy. I'm not sure it would have made any difference if they had a good one.
Yeah, I think a lot of it, really what's under attack here is the framework that Justice Thomas wrote and that everybody signed on to, because these other judges across the country, not just this one federal Fifth Circuit in New Orleans covering Texas case, but other courts around the country are striking down age restrictions, bans on homemade ghost guns, which don't have serial numbers, prohibitions on gun ownership for people convicted of nonviolent felonies or people using illegal drugs. So even Hunter Biden is caught up in this. That ruling where he should have disclosed that he had drugs, that might have been an unconstitutional question because it's never been asked on gun ownership documentation before. Here's a disqualifying question: do you do drugs? So that was one of the things. But I think a parenthetical point that you made, which is pretty interesting too, there was an amicus brief entered in the case where a historian said, look, I think everybody's getting the history wrong. We all think just because there weren't laws related to domestic violence until the 1970s doesn't mean that there weren't interruptions in the family balance when women would go to their magistrate in the 1700s and 1800s and say that they've been domestic violent
yes, it did
recipients
happen.
of abuse. Yeah, and they actually would bring in family members or elders of the community, and they would intervene, and there would be like a cooling off period, and kind of like almost like the cooler minds would prevail kind of thing. And they say that there wasn't a lot of handguns at the time. People really just had limited access to rifles, and it's not like domestic violence didn't include guns at the time. It included knives and other things more so than that. But I think one of the things, it didn't really come up because it was more about the history, again, because I said it was Thomas's framework, but just for our purposes currently, which is what's important for us, we live now, guns are used in 57% of the killings of spouses, partners, children, and relatives, according to the CDC. And 70 women a month are shot and killed by their partners. And Congress did recently pass a $13 billion package that includes funding and incentives for red flag laws. And Biden even announced that there's going to be an Office of Gun Violence Prevention. So this is a huge initiative here. And if it's the case that Thomas's framework was the prevailing doctrine here, then you'd basically say, well, how could you have a red flag law take effect? That person hasn't been convicted of a felony necessarily. They haven't always, just because somebody is in a dispute doesn't mean that they are truly going to be dangerous. So the history paradigm pales compared to the need and demand to protect against danger. So there was actually a lot of that definitional back and forth going. And then finally, I'll just add here that public opinion too. Half of Americans, when polled, think that gun laws need to be more strict just because of the mass killings that people are seeing, etc. 1/3 say things should stay the same, but only 10% think they should be less strict. And that breaks down in party lines. 8 out of 10 Democrats want stricter rules. Republicans are about half and half. Not that the polling should lead here, but the idea is that would be a little bit tone deaf to use a constitutional principle that it had to be in the 17th and 18th and 19th century, or else it's not valid today.
Right.
It's exposing it.
Yeah, there is common law. There is actually common law basis for some of this. Maybe not specific injunctions, but injunction is equitable relief. That's what you went to the courts of equity for, as opposed to the courts of law. There's history for it, even though now it's statutory. But I want to comment on it. We were talking about this guy Rahimi, that he was implicated because he actually fired bullets into a house using an AR-15 while he had an order against him. So he wasn't even supposed to possess that gun, let alone shoot into a house. And so,
which for the record, that's a different gun than the one he discharged during the domestic violence event.
Yes, yeah. But Chief Justice Roberts probed the attorney about whether or not Rahimi himself should be considered dangerous. He says, "You don't have any doubt that your client's a dangerous person, do you?" And Wright responded, "Well, that would depend on what your definition of dangerous is." And Roberts responded, "Someone who's, shooting at people, that's a good start." I mean, and this is coming from the conservative end, albeit the more moderately conservative. But again, there was dead silence. I think Justice Amy Coney Barrett also showed some indications that she was going to vote this way, and Thomas was dead silent, back to his old ways of not saying anything. So I'll let you close this out. We're almost to the end here.
Yeah, it was interesting to listen to everything that the justices had to say and their lines of questioning. The idea is that we do need to, as a society, follow some objective guidelines when we're going to be taking guns away from people. I don't think very many sheriffs want to go into people's homes and take their guns away. No. I don't think people necessarily want to voluntarily give their guns away, but there is a mechanism in place where judges will hold hearings to ask people, does anyone in your family have a weapon? Do you have access to guns at work? What happened to the guns listed on your federal firearms purchase history? And the purpose of this is to seek protection from domestic violence, stalking, school threats. So there is a mechanism in place that just needs to be defended here, and I think the Supreme Court's going to do that.
Eeny, meeny, chili beanie, the spirits are about to speak.
Are they friendly spirits?
Friendly? Just listen.
Well, that brings us to our final segment, predictions. Dave, what do you have for us?
I'll try to make this one my quickest one ever. So in the state of Ohio, we saw how the election turned out. We talked about it, that the sort of Democratic abortion rights protection did prevail and prevailed significantly. And you asked earlier in the show what might be the implications on Senator Sherrod Brown defending his seat. I looked up his polling, and there's just like two really distinct sets of polls. One having him, plus 10 to plus 22 against the three various people he's going against, and then the other one shows it much closer. But I think that based on what we've seen, my prediction is that he is going to be able to hold on to the seat, which it didn't look like this was going to be the case as recently as 6 months or a year ago. I think Sherrod Brown holds on, which is good news for Republicans trying to hold on to the majority in the Senate.
I think you're reversing yourself on this prediction.
Yeah.
I think you said that you predicted he was going to lose. Uh,
Yeah.
All right. Well, really quickly, the abortion has become. The Democrats know that this is their winning ticket. You can be cynical about it, but this is what brings young voters out. It's what motivates people and what ultimately impacts a lot of independent voters. Because basically, regardless of what you personally feel about abortion and where life starts, the bottom line is the majority of Americans do not believe in enslaving somebody even for 9 months. And I think Republicans are starting to come around this. Fox News last night had all kinds of discussions about maybe how we need to change our message to, calling for more public funds for, health care and the rest for the women once they're born. Maybe we need to be more pro-life, and maybe responding to criticisms of, that life begins at conception and ends at birth. I think Julianne Bond said that years ago. I'm predicting that the Republicans, there's going to be a major push to change their messaging on it. Trump has already kind of shown he's doing that. Nikki Haley is a little bit easing up on it, and this is going to be a civil war. And the Republicans, meanwhile, on the Democratic side, I think they're going to be looking for referendums to put on the ballot, like we had in California a couple of years ago, which was mostly symbolic because we already had the right to choose enshrined in our Constitution, but it's even more enshrined. So we'll see if that comes true. Until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.